everyone, this is Callimara here, and no, it's not calamari. Welcome back to my channel, or if you want to join the pond, go ahead and take a dive. You might like it here. So, if you've been swimming in my channel for a while, you might know that every once in a while, I like to reinterpret my sona. Yes, this very sona you gaze upon, through the lens of different media I like and want to be a part of, because that's what I do when I like media. I want to be a part of it. A self-insert, if you will. Yeah, I know the stigma around self-inserts and how they're usually poorly written, omniscient, omnipotent characters, also known as Mary Sue's or Gary Stu's, but because cringe culture is dead, I figure, why not make myself a Greek god while I'm at it, so I can be all those things. Is that offensive? I really hope it isn't, because I know polytheistic Hellenism still exists today, and I don't want to accidentally commit sacrilege. So I actually did a bit of Googling about this, and from what I could find on Quora, yes, very reputable, I know, the common consensus appears to be that it's fine because Greek myths are considered no different from public domain stories like Hans Christian Andersen type stories. And this user, Axel Newman, even gave a really good writing guide on how you can go about making up your own Greek deity, which we will be diving into a bit more during the actual design process. Because let's be honest, making up your own obscure Greek god no one's ever heard of before and pulling myths about said deities out of your ass is a favorite Tumblr pastime. And Valerie Bay says I should ask Zeus through the medium of chickens. I do not have chickens, but my neighbors do, so perhaps I shall ask Zeus and then ask my neighbor if their chickens ate in the morning. If I suddenly disappear from the face of the earth, you should probably assume that I was struck down by a thunderbolt. But I mean, if so many shows, movies, and games today can use it as the vehicle for the stories they want to tell, take their own liberties, and put their own creative spin on it, and not be smited, I have to assume that the Greek gods are probably okay with this. So while I originally thought I could design an already existing goddess to serve as my self-insert, and I have a very specific reason for why I thought to do this, I came to the conclusion that it might be better if I just made up a whole new goddess that has no historical or religious significance behind her, so I can be free to come up with my own original story and motifs that are more personal to me. Because remember, this is my self-insert, and hey, it's Halloween. One is allowed to dress up as whatever they wish, and this is what I choose to do with my free time, and who are you to judge? Plus, if Greek mythology happens to be your hyperfixation too, here's how you can make your own made-up deity while still hopefully navigating the topic with care and respect. So, if you're wondering about the context of this video, it might not be a surprise to some of you that I am a pretty big fan of Hades from Supergiant Games, mostly because of the stunning art and the fact that it's inspired by Greek mythology, which has been a special interest of mine since I first learned about it in 4th grade. And honestly, that interest kind of died off for a while when I started university, but then, this beautiful bisexual man appeared and he dragged me back into the pits of Tartarus with him. And of course, naturally, that was a gateway into Epic the Musical, which was also another Greek myth-inspired media that I am very interested in, but I'd only gotten into the fandom very recently. The first I'd heard of the production was when people were using the song Just a Man for Astarion edits on TikTok earlier this year, and then I heard Done For because someone made a Jelsa edit with it, so this musical kind of just encroached on my life through pieces of media I had already been obsessed with at the time, so I can't help but feel like I was being given a trail of breadcrumbs that was leading me to this musical one way or another. And it kind of sat in the back of my mind for a while because I tried looking it up. I tried to see if it was a completed production on Broadway or something, and I saw that, it was still in development. So I just thought, I'll wait until it's finished. But I was wrong. The illusion of free choice and all that. And yes, in case you're wondering, I do have something in the works for Epic as well that will be a fun surprise, so, just stay tuned. But anyway, this fierce reawakening of my Greek myth obsession has pushed me to think up ways for how I could insert myself into it, as I do with all pieces of media I love. I just want to be a part of it somehow. So, first things to consider. Making an OC that is respectful to Greek mythology, because keep in mind, this is still an existing religion that is being practiced today, and as I mentioned before, I think this person made a great guideline for how to do that, so I'll just read it out to you guys. Well, it's the same as creating a character for a book/video game/song, etc. You only need to respect the Greek mythology storyline, make it more or less credible for the Greek people, and sell it well. So let's make a Greek god. Duty. As we have a myriad or so of gods and goddesses, we need to create one whose responsibilities won't undermine the duties of his or her quote-unquote colleagues. This poses a difficult task as there are already gods of unmixed wine, beekeeping, etc. So after analyzing the list, I found out that we lack a god of missing people. Here we are. Usually those minor duties were appointed to goddesses. So we have a gender. In order not to give her too many duties, our goddess will be responsible exclusively for sailors. I do not heed by this rule, just so you guys know, but if you want to be reasonable, I guess you could follow this guideline. But let's get back on track. As we have already a goddess, Leucothea, and god, Melisartes, who help and try to save sailors in distress, our goddess's duty is to deliver the bad news to the family of a dead sailor. She is respected and feared simultaneously. No one wants to be visited by her, yet it's a noble task to free the families from false hope. Name. Let's give her a name. By Greek tradition, the name needs to mean something. I will take the word angelos, meaning messenger, plus penthos, which means morning. Let's transform it into Penthangelos. I am not from Greece, and neither from ancient Greece. I mean, I would hope not, so I'm not sure if it makes sense. I know that the name sounds clumsy, but I did not have a working ancient Greek dictionary on hand, and my fantasy is severely limited. Appearance. As per Greek custom, it's a beautiful woman, yet with a grief-stricken face. I am sure that it does not really matter, but let's give her soulful, tearful eyes so we know that she does not feel pleasure in giving us bad news. Penthangelos will be wearing a dark chiton and a cloak. In her hand, she will hold a small lantern in order to guide the lost souls to the shores. Hence, we can create a myth about the creation of lighthouses. Because remember, Greek myths usually end in the creation or the concept of something. Story. I am a bad storyteller, but let's take into account the dark themes of Greek mythology and apply them to our story. Penthangelos was a young woman whose husband was a sailor. Every time he went to the sea, she would accompany him with her lantern and hope for his safe return. Poseidon fell in lust with her and threatened to kill her husband if she would not lay with him. She refused, and Poseidon drowned his ship. Long days she waited on the shore for her husband. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Taking pity on her, Amphitrite, Poseidon's wife, told her the tragic news. Hearing it, Penthangelos jumped into the sea wishing for death. Yet as a mocking gift, Poseidon gifted her with immortality and gave her these responsibilities. So now she wanders, waiting at the shores and waiting for the lost souls of dead sailors to reach her so she will guide them to the underworld. So what do we need in the end? A set of duties, a name, and a backstory. Here we are. You have a new Greek goddess. I bet you can tell your friends about Penthangelos, and they will believe you. Yeah, I probably would. So, to summarize, the thing we should aim for is to not overlap or undermine the duties of other existing Greek gods, which I don't follow either, but let's not worry about that. Follow the traditional naming conventions, which back then they named stuff after these characters whose myths corresponded with the thing they're naming. But doing so retrospectively, my tip would be to look at what you want your god's myth to be, what their life story is, pick a theme, item, or action from that story, and then name them after said item, theme, or action. That way, their name would simply mean that thing you chose. Next, and perhaps the most important part, the story. While it's possible for the story to follow the design, I'd actually written a lot of lore and ideas for this character before ever designing her, and it helped me go through the design process much faster. So I would recommend coming up with the lore and story first. Greek myths are infamous for their dark themes and tragedies, so writers, here's your chance to go all out with the angst. Don't hold back. Do you think if Greek myths were written in this day and age, they'd be considered edgy emo fiction? Like in 1,000 or 5,000 years' time, will My Immortal become a classical tragedy? It's already got all the components. Anyway, let me show you my plan for my goddess design. So, to organize and keep track of all the millions of ideas and connections that were just bestowed upon me from the heavens, I'm once again teaming up with my favorite delusion enabler, Milanote. Milanote is a tool that helps you organize ideas, compile inspirations and references to create your own mood board and list tasks you need to do, all in one digital corkboard. If you guys know me, you know I don't play when it comes to the research I do for my design projects, and Milanote helps me grab bits of information and images much faster and easier with their web clipper tool, which makes resource gathering a lot easier. But sometimes I lose track of which scraps of inspo and info are for which bit, and this means I completely forget to include certain components or bits of information completely. But Milanote makes it a lot easier for me to keep all my references together and arrange it in a way that helps me keep my ideas and the associated references and evidence in one place so I don't leave anything out. So throughout this design/redesign process, you'll see me referring to this board a lot. And you guys know me, I am all about frenetic energy and organized chaos, keyword here being organized. So because this board is a lot already for anyone looking at it who isn't me, Milanote's subboard feature really comes in handy because it lets me move the other sprawling board I made for the writing component. And worry not, I will be walking you through every single step and stray thought I had during my design process using this board, and how you can use Milanote to make your own character designs, because I doubt my design would have turned out as well as it had without it. Planning is such an important and underlooked component of character design, so to help you up your planning game, you can also view this board and use it as a reference using the link in my description. Also, if you're thinking of doing something similar to this, Milanote is available for free with no time limit. Just use the other link in my description, the one at the very top. So thank you Milanote for sponsoring this video, and let's get right into my design board. So here is my design mood board that I created to design my very own. I put down Hades Sona here, but really it's just if this creature was a Greek goddess. So this isn't the first time I attempted something like this. In case you guys didn't know, I drew this piece when I covered Good Riddance from the Hades soundtrack, because I've always been obsessed with Hades, in case you didn't know. And the vibes I wanted to go for this particular design that I put down here to keep myself on track is playful, charming, whimsical, ethereal, bright, and delicate. So this is my style, and I don't know, I feel like I've kind of changed from this now, but let's pretend that my art style still looks like this. And we want to go for Gen Z's art style for Hades, which to me is absolutely terrifying because it's so proportionally realistic, and it is just everything that my art is not and things that I purposefully avoid because I fear it. So I'm gonna try and challenge myself here, but the goddess that I've decided to pull as my main inspiration that has kind of the similar vibe that I'm gonna go for is Aphrodite, mostly because she's also pink, and you guys know I love pink. So let's talk about some of the benchmarks of the Hades art style that I'm gonna have to try to replicate later on, being the Terminator lines here, which I've marked using the draw tool. So Hades is all about those Terminator lines that kind of blend together it's like a transitional color between the shadows and the light, but also it has these really stylistic dark shadows that I think are so punchy and so eye-catching. The shadows aren't as prevalent in Hades 2, as you can see here as a comparator, and my speculation for that is that Hades 1 takes place entirely in the underworld, where the depth of shadows is supposed to be like super intense, so like it makes sense for them to have these like really deep dark shadows, whereas Hades 2, you kind of start off on the surface and you have to battle your way down to the underworld, so it makes sense that they kind of have better lighting. But you can still kind of see those like stylistic shadows, though it's not as exaggerated as it used to be. That's because Hellboy was actually cited as the original reference for the Hades art style, particularly for the coloring, shading style, because just have a look at these. This is basically just the Lernaean Hydra right here. And yeah, I think it's really cool and really stylized. And honestly, I've heard some people complaining that, oh, the second game looks much less stylistic and less distinct from the first game, but I like them both. They both have their charm, okay? I think they're both awesome. Aside from that, I put down Celine as one of my inspirations as well, because I love how flowy and delicate she looks, and that's definitely something I'm gonna try to emulate in my character design as well. And another thing that I kind of wrote down over here in case it doesn't make sense to anyone but me is heroic nudity, which is a concept in kind of how in ancient Greek art, where they would use nudity to show divinity, essentially. So all those like naked marble statues of kings and gods, historically they're not really that big on being naked all the time. They're actually quite conservative in their dress, but it's an artistic expression. But I like the concept of it. I want to try and push for that because I think it's a really cool stylistic choice and expression. And so to do that, I looked at possible clothing styles I could use that were used for Greek goddesses on their statue, and I'm particularly drawn by this design of Hebe, who is Hera and Zeus's daughter, particularly because of the asymmetry going on here and kind of the, I guess I would say, masculine way that she wears her clothes, because typically if you looked at traditional chitons for women, were usually tied a bit higher, usually just under the bust. To compare it to modern day clothing would look something like a baby doll dress, where it would be like tied up here. And men tended to tie their chitons a bit lower. That's why it tends to expose more of their torsos as well in, like, you know, artistic depictions and such. But I like this because it feels like it's a bit of a masculine touch to an otherwise rather feminine design. And I was also kind of really drawn to this because this is kind of a similar way that we used to dress in Indonesia as well, particularly in Java and Bali and Lombok and the surrounding islands. Women practically dressed the same as men in that we only really covered our lower regions, whereas the upper regions were exposed. And we only started covering up, particularly Balinese women, because that was kind of the last refuge for the ancient kingdom of Majapahit when like other kingdoms expanded in Java. They were pretty much forced to cover up by the Dutch, you know, because white men can't handle seeing bare breasts, I suppose. So yeah, it's kind of like an homage to that, to my culture as well. So that's why I felt particularly drawn to this style of dress, because I think it translates well to my personal identity, because this is a Greek goddess, but the thing with Hades is that it also features gods with different ethnicities, because their philosophy is that although these gods were worshipped in ancient Greece, they themselves were never said to be Greek. And I really like that philosophy, so I'm kind of carrying that over to my design. And these are just accessories that I particularly liked and wanted to incorporate into my character design, especially these Lily of the Valley earrings, which will be really relevant for her lore, just for the symbolism. But this is the kind of vibe and style that I was going for her accessories, her hairstyle. And I'm particularly pleased and excited for this body chain, because remember, she's gonna have like half her chest exposed, so that's gonna help really cover up and fill in that empty space and really decorate and accessorize. And hopefully, if all goes to plan, it's gonna look something like this. And because we are aiming for whimsy and charming and playful, I decided to go with these ribbon lace up sandals, I guess. They won't really be sandals, they'll just be ribbons around her legs to emulate the style of sandals that were worn at the time, I suppose. I just thought it was really cute. And aside from that, I also want to, once I start coloring in, do an iridescent coloring for the fabric of the chiton, because I know it's kind of blasphemous, but I want to do something different from my usual theme of water and underwater creatures, because I don't know, kind of represent different aspects of myself and my personality. And the aspect that I kind of want to lean into this time is the fact that I am a Gemini, which is an air sign, so we're going to be leaning more into the wind theme here, which is going to tie back into the lilies of the valley, which are also known as Maybells, and that's going to tie them into wind chimes, because, you know, back in ancient times, wind chimes are basically just bells that were hung up and they ring when they get blown by the wind. So it's like a similar concept, all correlating to the theme of wind. Maybe I should have said that earlier, but who cares? I'm doing this without a script, and so you are forced to follow my organized chaos way of thinking, okay? So, speaking of the Lily of the Valley, that is my chosen symbol for my goddess, and I will be using that to design her insignia for her boon later on. I'm kind of using Demeter's boon as inspiration here, because I think it has like a lot of these tiny little pieces that are a bit more complex compared to the other gods, and that's something I kind of want to try and emulate, because Lilies of the Valley or Maybells kind of form in the same shape, I suppose. I don't know. This is just a good starting off point for me, and these are just some designs that I found that I particularly liked. This one in particular is kind of what I had in mind initially, because it looked a bit similar to Demeter's design, so that I know it's like plausible for them. But then I also found this really cute whimsical heart design, and the heart is relevant here because Lilies of the Valley, or Maybells, or the Convallaria Majalis, contains a toxin, I suppose, or a substance called a cardiac glycoside, or a cardinolide, which is the main ingredient used in certain medications that you use to treat heart problems like palpitations or atrial fibrillation, in medications like digoxin. So that's what that is. I'm not gonna go too deep into this, but this is also another aspect I wanted to represent in this goddess design, is my interest in medicine and healthcare in general. So, I'm not going to give you guys like a full lecture on pharmacology, but essentially the idea is that there are several plants like foxgloves that can be used as the main ingredient for medications like digoxin, which treat heart conditions like atrial fibrillation, like I said, atrial flutter, and congestive heart failures. You don't need to know this part, the mechanism of action, that's a bit complicated, but basically what you need to know is that this medicine helps the heart beat stronger and more steadier, so that it can better deliver blood and oxygen to the rest of our body. And while digoxin is derived from foxgloves, Lilies of the Valley also produce a type of cardiac glycoside, which is that main ingredient we need for the medicine, called convalatoxin. And this convalitoxin kind of functions the same way as the substance in foxgloves, but it's not used for digoxin. And I mentioned digoxin a lot because it's just the most commonly prescribed medication for these conditions. But it's also possible to derive it from lilies of the valley, and it was actually used for this similar treatments even back in ancient Greek times. And this one is just, it was just a fun coincidence, I suppose, a little bit of a scary coincidence because I picked this flower at random just because I liked it. I have several lilies of the valley paraphernalia in my room as I'm recording this, but apparently it has ties to Apollo, who will be very relevant in the lore later on, and who apparently was the one to discover this plant. And so it is also known as Apollinaris. And it was given to his son Asclepius, who, in case you guys didn't know, is the Greek god of medicine. And I happen to be in medicine right now. And my dream, in fact, is to become a cardiovascular surgeon, which is related to the heart. So this is just kind of a terrifying coincidence. And that's basically why Lily of the Valley is her main symbol, because it represents something that I like, and it ties in very closely to something I'm passionate about, as well as tying to our overall theme of air and the wind. So we're having fun. This is great. It's all falling into place. I also picked out a color palette that I liked that I'm planning on using for the character once I have the design down. And on top of that, I also picked a few poses that I liked that I'm going to use to inspire my goddess design, because she needs to have a fun pose, obviously. I think these poses best embody the vibes that I'm going for. Particularly for this first image, I liked how the dress is flowing. The second one, I really like the lighting. I like how ethereal it is. I like her arm position in particular, and her hand position here as well, because you know, guys, hands can be pretty hard. It helps to have references on hand. But this one is going to be the primary gesture because it's already a full body shot. So I'm gonna try and replicate the main idea of this pose while adjusting it to my needs, because I want my goddess to hold something to kind of accessorize and just for a bit of flair. And I think it'd be fun if she had like a staff similar to the Caduceus or Asclepius's rod or something. So yeah, that's pretty much everything that I can share with you guys about the inspirations for my goddess design that I will be using as a benchmark and guide for this redesign. And once I have the design, we can go into this fun little subboard and see what she's all about. But for now, let's hop back to Speed Draw Callie. Alright, let's get to drawing. While I am excited, I'm also utterly terrified and daunted by the idea of having to emulate the Hades art style by Gen Z because, well, it is everything I am terrible at and have the least amount of practice in. This art style is very far out of my comfort zone because if you guys know me, I avoid realism like the plague, whereas Gen Z's art for Hades relies heavily on realistic proportions and almost Western superhero comic type stylings, which isn't surprising considering Hellboy was one of the main inspirations for the art style. But also, it is an art style I'm usually not a fan of. If you've seen any of my art before, you might know that I lean way more to Eastern comic styles, and that's where I'm comfortable. That is my wheelhouse. So this feels like a trip into uncharted waters, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I am very scared. But I am determined to challenge myself to replicate this art style because I think it will do me a lot of good in the long run. So the first hurdle is also the one aspect of my art I get the most criticism about: anatomy. And I took it so seriously, I enrolled in medical school and aced my anatomy exams, so... But let's see if that actually helped, and I will be so mad if it actually does. Look, I like to keep my art loose and whimsical. I do not need nor wish to be grounded by reality, but for this piece, I must. Which is ironic considering it's a piece for a Greek goddess. But anywho, to resolve this issue of mine, who would have thought it really helped having references on hand? Luckily, I've already compiled the pose inspirations I wanted to do on my Milanote mood board, so I can just copy and paste it onto the layer so I have a clear direction of what I'm going for. For this illustration, I'm using my iPad Pro, and I kind of wish I'd done it on my PC so I can have two monitors to work with, one to look at my Milanote board and one exclusively dedicated to the illustration. But the name of the game here is portability because I am rarely at home these days and I wanted to be able to work on this drawing whenever I got the opportunity to. The downside is, of course, that I can't exactly do split screen because it's a nightmare when you're illustrating on iPad, which is why you'll see me constantly switching back and forth between apps later. So for the pose, my main reference will be the leftmost image because it's already holding a pole, which I will be turning into her signature staff because, fun fact, the idea of a wind deity actually came from Jack Frost, whom you may know is never without his trusty staff, but also how the wind plays such an integral role in his characterization. He moves with the unpredictability and swiftness of the wind itself, and I'm so in love with the freedom of Jack's movement when he flies, his confident swagger when he walks, the way he poses himself with his staff. I wanted to do the same with my goddess, and honestly, I think it'll add a fun, unique, masculine touch to an otherwise very predictably feminine design. Because in case you guys didn't know, I was quite a tomboy growing up. I really didn't like conforming to the gender norms of liking pink and makeup and going shopping. You know, look at me now. But I needed that phase, and that's something that I want to try and incorporate in this design as well. If you follow me on my social media, you may have already seen how her final design turns out. But I was very determined to keep her wingless, even though the wind gods were traditionally depicted with wings, and usually muscular, so hey, she has that going for her at least, because I wanted to just have her fly on the wind like Jack does. But in any case, I particularly adored this pose because of how whimsical, playful, and free it is, which are exactly the vibes we're going for this design. Obviously, it takes a lot of flexibility, balance, and strength to be able to pull off this pose, which is perfect for my deity to show her freedom of movement and physical prowess. But it's actually a lot more complex than it looks, mostly in that the trunk of the body is curving in a lot of different directions. The pelvic area is in protrusion, thrusted out, whereas the thoracic region and upper extremities are leaning back, creating more of a bottom-up perspective, which then affects the way her breasts would sit on her chest and the way her abs overlap, to even how her face would be angled. Moreover, the trunk of the body is also twisting in opposite directions between the chest area, which is twisting towards the right or our left, and the hip area, which is twisting to the left or our right. And you'll see me drawing a guideline just to make a note of this for myself. So yeah, there's actually a lot of subtle details to keep in mind, which are very easy to mess up when trying to draw it for myself, because it's all super subtle and very easy to miss. But I think overall, I managed to capture the gesture and energy of the pose about as well as I'd hoped I would. Next came the second obstacle to drawing in Hades' art style, the face. Obviously, when it comes to faces, I lean either Disney or mangas/manhwas. I do not like drawing realistic proportions for the face at all. And that is also part of the reason why I will never pick up a Western comic book. But I'm going to have to try for this challenge. But I'll be honest, my compromise was mostly draw smaller eyes and detail the nose a bit more. but that was about it. While drawing the hair, I had debated including my Sona's hime cut as well because I do consider it as one of my Sona's trademarks, but I realized that it would cover up the character's ears, which would stop me from being able to show off the intricate earrings I had picked out and really wanted to include for lore reasons. So I decided against it. For her clothes, as I mentioned in my mood board, I wanted to push for heroic nudity as much as I could without being smited by the YouTube guidelines, and I think the asymmetrical Kiton style would really suit my needs here. And honestly, I hadn't planned for the fabric to fall that low, but I drew fantastic abs and I was gonna show it, damn it. But on the other hand, it also gave the design a bit of a masculine touch that would allude to that tomboyish past of mine, because typically women would tie their girdles higher on their torso, often right beneath the bust, whereas men tied their chitons at the hip, which lets it fall lower, exposing more of the torso. And, you know, she's a goddess. She doesn't need to conform to gender norms. She can do whatever she wants, and no one can say or do anything about it. I drew 2 variations of the chiton though, because I wasn't really feeling the way the first one fell about her body. This second one was inspired by the way Zagreus wears his chiton, because I really liked how regal yet casual it looks. Anyway, I like the way the skirts fell around her waist much better on this one, but arguably it looked a lot heavier on her, which is counterintuitive to the airy, carefree vibe I was going for. She just does not have the shoulders for them, unfortunately. Next, we get to the fun part, the accessories. As you guys saw on my mood board, I gathered a lot of accessory ideas for this design, and this is what's really gonna tie the entire look together. The main points of emphasis for her accessories are the ribbons on her legs to simulate lace-up Greek sandals, her lily of the valley earrings that dangle like little bells or wind chimes over her ears, her lily of the valley wreath, and the body chains, which I was the most excited about because it's really gonna fill that empty space left by her chiton. I remember watching a design analysis of the Hades gods once, and it mentioned that each of the gods, be it chthonic or Olympian, exude a sense of opulence through the precious metals and gems they wear. And that was really what inspired me to put more focus on the opulent accessories. So to balance the focus, I am keeping the chiton relatively simple. Plus, my intention is to design a minor goddess. I don't want her looking more grand than the major gods of the pantheon, though I don't know if I ended up following through with that in the end. You guys decide. And speaking of the chiton, I ended up creating a third alternative that blended the 2 previous alternatives together and was more inspired by Milanote's dress from Hades 2, and I like this one much better, so this is the base I will be moving forward with. After that, I blocked in her staff so I know where it's going and adjusted the position of her hand to go along with where the staff is to make it look like she's daintily holding on to it. And because the accessories I'd blocked in were really distracting and making it difficult for me to differentiate from line art and the actual body of the accessories, I filled it in with gold to help me identify it better and make sure I was happy with the shape and flow of it. It also just immediately helped make the drawing look a bit closer to completion. Next, we finally get to the back portion of her hair that I was honestly kind of procrastinating on doing because I was scared of messing it up. There was definitely a lot of fear and uncertainty involved in this design that I had to push through. I still wanted her hair to curl in a tentacle-y way, like in my original design, and it was quite serendipitous that they also resembled how wind gusts are symbolically depicted in drawn media. See, doesn't that kind of look like tentacles as well? This design just keeps falling into place, and you know, it's kind of exciting and scary at the same time. But to be honest, looking back on it now, I could probably make her curls a little tighter to resemble the wind gusts a bit more, but oh well. Perhaps in future depictions, and there certainly will be, wink wink. And next we finally get to the part I was the most excited about, aside from the body chains, the colors. As you guys may remember, I had included a color palette I wanted to use for this design on my Milanote board, but unfortunately when I started coloring in with it, I realized that they were a lot more pale than I was expecting. I had this image in my head that this design was gonna be super tanned because not only does she spend a lot of time outdoors, she also spends a lot of time around the god of light and the sun because she serves under Apollo. But we'll get into that in more detail later when we talk about her lore. So that's all to say that this color palette just isn't gonna cut it. Now, Hades has a very unique color palette compared to a lot of media I've seen before. It plays with the contrast between saturated and desaturated colors. For instance, look how much paler and washed out the skin colors of chthonic gods look compared to the vibrancy of their signature colors. The pops of red, purple, and you'd think it's a trait exclusive to the chthonic gods because, well, they don't exactly see a lot of sun. But the trend continues for the Olympians too. Their skin seems to possess this pallor in comparison to the gold they wear, the pop of their signature colors, red for Ares, blue for Athena, purple for Dionysus, and so on. The only exception to this rule are characters like Persephone, Achilles, and Patroclus. And what do those three have in common? Well, they're mortals, or at least partially mortal or used to be mortal, since in the game's version of the myth, Persephone is a demigod, as Demeter had her with an unnamed mortal farmer and not Zeus. So I think this decision helps to emphasize that though the gods appear human, they're something else entirely. But it does hurt me, I'm not gonna lie, to make the skin color so ashy. But on top of that, this also means that I can't really use my regular color palette on this design because it needed some adjustment. But in the end, I was pretty happy with the colors I came up with. I think it hit that tanned complexion I was looking for while still emulating the spirit of my original color palette in its own way. Next, I'm just quickly drawing out the sun insignia they used for Apollo in Hades 2 to go on her chiton to signify who she is associated with. And fun fact, I also imagine that all these pretty jewelry she wears were gifts from Apollo, because in case you didn't know, he is also the god of beauty alongside Aphrodite as the goddess of beauty. And I imagine he wants everyone working for him to always look their best, perhaps as a way to show off his affluence, status, and generosity as well. After that, I get to her chiton. As I'd shown in my Milanote board, I wanted her chiton to be iridescent. I wanted to be able to reflect different colors at different angles, different lightings, kinda like that iridescent cloud I showed. And I think this also serves as a representation of her vivacious personality, her adaptability, being able to reflect the person she is interacting with, to adjust herself to anyone and everyone around her. Naturally, such a fine, rare fabric could only be a gift from Apollo as well, and she wears it proudly. Honestly, I don't know. I imagine her just running around buck naked before she met him. And you know, we love her for that. Because this fabric is iridescent, I took it as my chance to incorporate my signature colors, blue, pink, and gold. While I like how it looks now, I do end up shifting the hue later on and finding a color combination I like more, but you'll see. And finally, we get to the part I was arguably the most terrified of, the shading. I'll be honest, I had no idea what I was going to do or how I was going to go about it, because it had been a hot minute since I did a full illustration with shading and everything, and I've forgotten how. And that's not great, considering the shading is arguably Hades' most iconic aspect of its art style. It's so detailed and distinct, and so, you know, it's a big shoe to fill. I was genuinely worried that I wasn't gonna be able to complete this piece because of the shading. So I did admittedly cheat this part a little bit. I used Clip Studio Paint's Shading Assist feature to help me figure out where the shadow placement should go relative to the contours of the body, and it also helped me pick the colors I liked for said shadows. And then I used that as a reference to actually start shading in and putting down those signature block-out shadows. And now, let's talk about her lore. Who is this goddess I'm drawing? So let's start with her name. Initially, I wanted to name her after myself because, fun fact, my real life name, Callista, which is neither Callimara nor calamari, is already Greek, and while I really like it and its meaning, it is derived from the name Callisto, which is an already existing figure in Greek mythology who has her own story and legend. And while I did consider designing Callisto, I wanted to come up with something of my own. Her lore is just way too different from who I am and what I'm comfortable depicting myself as, particularly in the fact that she has to get involved with Zeus. So that option's out. So my second idea was maybe giving her multiple origin stories based on the name similarity alone. Because like I said before, I came up with this character story long before I ever came up with her design, and actual Greek gods tend to have conflicting stories about how they came to be. Like Callista being the lesser-known twin sister of Callisto, where one served Apollo and the other served Artemis. And in other versions, she's not related to Callisto at all. But I kind of felt hesitant because it might get a bit too weird and personal for me to use my actual real-life name for an OC and have other people refer to her with my real-life name as well. It just felt like I was opening Pandora's box, so I decided on a different name to create a bit of distance between myself and the character. So, instead of my name, I looked to the flower that symbolizes her, the lily of the valley, or Maybells, to make things easier. Since most of the names of Greek deities are derived from the thing they are known for, I will be following the same theme and pretend as though Maybells were named after her, as we discussed earlier at the start of the video. So, the Latin name for the Maybell is Convallia Majalis, which is derived from the word Vallia, meaning valley, and Majalis, which means of the month of May. And yes, I totally remembered that off the top of my head, no big deal. Out of those two, I personally enjoy the Vallia sound, and I wanted to keep a part of my name in it, if only a little. So I have decided her name is Calvallia. I think it has a nice flow, and it can reasonably be inferred that she has some relation to the word convallia. So, we have a name, but who is Calvallia? Well, as I've mentioned multiple times before, I wanted to lean into the air sign aspect of my personal identity, so Calvallia is an anemoi, otherwise known as a wind god, which I think already lines up pretty well with her playful, effervescent appearance. Basically, the main idea behind this character ended up being, what if the Gemini zodiac was a Greek goddess? And here we are. So, she's a wind god, but specifically, I've decided that she is the east wind, and you're probably thinking, that's a pretty major position for an OC to fill, right? There probably already is a god of the east wind. Well, I did a bit of research, and it turns out there's a bit of a contention among historians regarding the identity of the east wind. If you googled who is the east wind, the first result that comes up is Eurus or Euros. But if you looked into it a bit more, you learn that there is some contention on whether Eurus is actually the east wind or the southeast wind specifically. Unlike the other three cardinal directions, he does not have a season assigned to him, much like Lips, aka the southwest wind, and is often omitted entirely, such that the cardinal directions are often only represented by Zephyrus, who is also the most well-known because of his involvement in Hyacinth's story, Boreas, and Notus. Zephyrus is also known as the gentle spring winds, Boreas, the frigid winter winds, and Notus, the scorching summer winds, but also the destroyer of crops of early autumn. And there is a notable gap for mid to late autumn winds. And yes, I know Apeliotis also exists, and he's the one that's said to be the southeast wind as well, but he is still not associated with a particular season, but rather refreshing rain that is beneficial to farmers, and he is often amalgamated with Eurus. So, a lot of confusion there, and I'm really determined to make this work, so you know what? I'll take it. Because another reason I also chose the east wind specifically, and I honestly could have chosen southeast as well, but it seems that both Eurus and Apeliotis already fills in the position of southeast wind, so I feel like that's even more overlap, is because, well, I'm from Asia. Southeast Asia specifically, which is located further east, so it's an homage to that, but also another tie to the sun and Apollo as the direction from which the sun rises, which is why I'd like to use Apeliotis as an alias for Calvalia, much like Kore is an alias for Persephone, because the name Apeliotis means from the rising sun, and I really like that, and I'm pretty sure all the times I've said the name Apeliotis, I've said it in a different way every time. But, that means I'm bound to get at least one of them right. But hey, maybe it's even like a little pet name Apollo uses for her. So, in this version of Greek myth that I am slowly developing, I suppose, Calvalia is the east wind and Eurus is the southeast winds, who is also responsible for bringing refreshing rain that is beneficial to farmers. So he works well with his sister Calvalia. And so Calvalia, the east wind, is also the bringer of autumn. Rather than destroying crops like her brother Notus, her duty is to return Persephone to the underworld after her 6 months on Olympus during the spring and summer. Her winds are playful and mercurial. They shake dead leaves from trees, sweeping them up in a joyous dance when she passes. Hence why the autumn leaves are also considered one of her sacred symbols. Her arrival marked by the sound of wind chimes, even when there aren't any. The reason she often doesn't get mentioned among the cardinal directional winds is because being in Apollo's service means she no longer resides in Mount Haemus with her brothers, so she's usually absent when they gather together, much to her dismay. And because she is an anemoi, and the anemoi are often depicted as winged gods, I also caved and ended up giving Calvalia 2 pairs of wings because I have no self-restraint, I'm sorry. And I didn't record it either because I already have so much drawing footage and I only have so much time. But basically, she ends up with 1 pair sprouting from her back like her brothers, but also a 2nd pair sprouting from her head to signify not only her freedom and flexibility of thought, but also another component of her domain, mania and delusions. So, why mania and delusions? Well, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that a bit of madness is kind of a given around here, and I always like to think that a bit of madness is required when it comes to creativity or even innovation. Hence why Calvalia is also the patron of researchers and obsessed artists, and also because those 2 things are what I am. If you know, you know. Basically, the central theme here is productivity. And remember, this is a self-insert, so she needs to represent me in my purest, most unhinged form. Mania is defined as a mental illness marked by periods of great excitement or euphoria, delusions, and overactivity, or even an obsession. Gosh, I've never done anything like that before. And that's also why I've chosen hummingbirds as her sacred animal, because they're small and agile and they're always flitting back and forth. They also have elevated heart rate, resulting in a crazy metabolic rate that forces them to constantly be eating in order to not starve to death and die. And that's why they're always so busy going back and forth. And that's kind of just how I picture Calva. Meanwhile, I chose the Dumbo octopus because I just think they're cute and they're one of my favorite animals. It's also an homage to my original water-based design, and I think symbolically they work as well because they kind of look like little bells. And if you looked at her boon, you can kind of see a little Dumbo octopus in it as well. But everything else within her domain falls into that theme, like cleanliness and organization. That sudden desire to deep clean the entire house and reorganize all your belongings that strike you out of the blue in the middle of the night, particularly when you're procrastinating. That's her. The sudden burst of inspiration and endless energy you get when it comes to researching a particular interest or indulging in a creative activity you enjoy to the point you forget to eat, drink, and sleep. Yeah, that's her. And this theme of creativity as well is also why she falls so well beneath Apollo's domain. I kind of just picture her as this Alice in Wonderland character, full of whimsy and charm, but also startling intelligence and insightfulness mixed in with the madness, which is why tact is also listed alongside whimsy. Like her head isn't completely on her shoulders, much like a low wisdom, high intelligence D&D character. And as my friend Chris so aptly put it, I am all about frenetic energy and controlled chaos, and so that is why I chose the design that I did for her boon, because I wanted it to still look organized and symmetrical, but also with a lot of frills and whimsical touches to it that disrupts the order a little bit to allow a bit of flair and creativity. And using the way that Lilies of the Valleys naturally curve, I turned it into a heart, which is not a new concept, but I think it's apt here because of the Maybelle's ties to the heart through the cardiac glycosides it contains. And based on the legend that does exist for the Maybelle or Apollinaris, it was said that the flower was discovered by Apollo and given to Asclepius, which, in other words, we can kind of infer that maybe one of Calvalia's first jobs was something to do with Asclepius. And I also find it interesting how in a lot of poisoning cases, when it comes to the Maybelles, it's usually kids eating the berries. And so I like to imagine that she just isn't very fond of kids. So I think it'd be funny if Calvalia was tasked to raise Asclepius and not liking it one bit, but maybe she taught him a thing or two about healing alongside Chiron. They could co-parent him. But mania was the main reason why I gave her these head wings, to symbolize having your mind caught in a delusion and floating away from reality, perhaps as some form of escapism as well. Hence, she also presides over whimsy and creative expression and thought, over both having your head full of ideas and their actualization. She sparks the ability to examine problems from different angles to find the best path forward. But it's not just ideas and solutions that she fills your head with. She is also the bestower of those fake scenarios one cries over while laying in bed, the constructor of vivid scenes in one's mind while listening to music or reading a story, and the cause of earworms. Because again, her main inspiration are the traits commonly associated with air signs, which represent intellect, communication, and social interaction, highlighting a focus on ideas, relationships, and intellectual engagement. But she does have a mischievous streak to her as well, pushing people to give in to their impulsive thoughts, and even whispering in people's ears to jump when they're up somewhere high. To sum it all up, I wrote a codex entry like one might find in Hades 1.
I've often heard that when one stands upon a high ledge, a mysterious voice calls for them to jump. Only a few unfortunate men have bared witness to the being whose voice they hear, a winged deity with her eyes covered. It is said that looking directly into her eyes induced mania, a feeling of euphoria and immense productivity, perhaps beyond that of a mere mortal's means. Though her influences undoubtedly led to the untimely demise of countless souls in the obsessive toil of her craft, there are many still who would risk their own demise for her twisted gift.
Now, as I've previously mentioned, she also serves Apollo. And before I get into what she does for him, you might be wondering why I chose Apollo to be the major god she is associated with. Well, I kind of answered a little bit of that just before, but with her domains and creativity and such, but also because this character is me, I wanted to choose a Greek god that aligned the most with my path in life and who I am as a person. As an artist, musician, registered nurse, and future doctor, hopefully, it's pretty undeniable that Apollo is the only Greek deity that would wholly encompass who I am, and because he's one of my favorite Greek gods too. So that's why I chose Apollo, and also because I don't know, those crazy coincidences where a lot of the themes I chose for her already involved him in some way. As for her duties to Apollo, I imagine her as his personal messenger, because she is the wind and she can get around pretty fast. His delegate, because as unhinged as she can be sometimes, she does have a way with words and people. His secretary, because she seems to enjoy organizing and doing administrative work for some ungodly reason, and singing partner whenever he needs a second voice for his songs. Now, I know you're probably looking at her domain in singing and musical harmony and raising an eyebrow thinking, that's probably something one of the 9 muses does, isn't it? And you're kind of right. See, it used to be Melpomene's area of expertise, including lyre playing, but at some point, that delegation was changed, and she was simply referred to as the Muse of Tragedy. So, shockingly, it is available, and I am grabbing it like the greedy little goblin that I am. And with that, I've pretty much covered all of the bases for her domain and responsibilities. All except one, really. Her domain of remedies, and why the lily of the valley is her symbol. For that, let's dive into her legend. Calvalia was an Atlantean princess. The oldest of her 4 sisters, she was a gifted singer and performer. Charming, but also clever. She was studious and a fast learner, and her intelligence helped her to become a skilled healer. As a princess, she had high expectations placed on her shoulders. Perfection was a standard, not an ideal, and she always strived to reach it to please the Atlantean king and queen. At the expense of her childhood, her own hopes and dreams, her desire to see the world, she pursued this unattainable goal, holding faith that, one day, if she attained it, her wish to travel the world and find adventure would be granted by the king. She was utterly consumed in her desire to reach that fabled perfection, unallowed to engage in play and form connections as her younger sisters had. She was the oldest, and thus the role model. She had to refuse suitors, to stifle her feelings, forbidden from finding companions and forming meaningful connections that the king and queen saw as distracting from her self-development. She healed others, but never found the same healing herself. Though she would argue with them, she would always bow to their authority in the end, promising them perfection, promising herself freedom. And she found temporary freedom through her daydreams and fantasies, finding comfort and strength in the stories of what could be in her mind, and expressed her true thoughts and feelings in the music she played, under the guise of metaphor and poetry. While her younger sisters found companionship, love, and spouses of their own, Calvalia remained alone, revered and admired by all, but still toiling at her impossible task. Unallowed to engage in the world around her until she had completed it. She was to ascend the throne, but as a princess, she was required to marry. However, when she thought she would finally be able to make a decision for herself, she learned that the king had chosen a suitor for her, a wealthy prince from the neighboring kingdom of Lemuria. With this arrangement, she realized then that her hopes of attaining freedom were in vain. Her suitor would become king, and as his queen, she would only become more trapped. Realizing this, Calvalia was driven to desperation and near insanity. She pleaded for help, for escape, but no one listened to her plight. Her siblings had all moved far away, and she had never established any meaningful connections in her life. And so, feeling alone and unheard, with no means of escape, she took her own life by consuming a tonic of maybells, her favorite flowers, knowing of the deadly convolatoxin they contained. As she lay dying, the west winds blew past, carrying Zephyrus on his circumnavigation of the earth. He heard the princess's dying wish to be free as the wind, and sensing her kindred spirit, he resurrected her as a goddess of the wind herself. The flowers that she had used to take her life became her symbol, signifying hope and the return of happiness, which had been what her death had given her, finally gaining freedom and control over her life by ending it. In death, she also found salvation, as Atlantis would soon sink beneath the waves and claim the lives of everyone in it. So, why did I choose Atlantis for her origins specifically? Well, it's a bit of an homage to my water theme on this channel and the transitioning of one identity to the next, but also because of a popular theory that is widely believed here in Indonesia that Atlantis was actually the lost continent of Sundaland, which is this giant landmass that existed a really long time ago that would end up sinking beneath the waves, leaving only the current Indonesian archipelago, or at least the western part of it. So again, it's kind of a reference to my origins, and also it's part of the reason why I wanted Calvalia to be the goddess of the east winds, because she came from the east. And also the reason why I specifically chose Zephyrus to be the one to find her is because Notus and Boreas would probably be flying north to south constantly, whereas Zephyrus would be the only one flying west to east. And that is how he happened upon her. And as an additional part of her lore, because these lilies of the valley symbolize such a tragic event in Calvalia's life, I imagine when she cries, where her tears fall, a lily of the valley blooms. And that's how Apollo would come to discover the flowers when she first arrives in Thrace, Greece, for the first time with Zephyrus as a new wind goddess. And that's also why lilies of the valley are also known as Our Lady's Tears, which has a similar legend attributed to it through Christian folklore. But I like to imagine it was originally inspired by Calvalia's legend. And of course, with Calvalia being an anemoi herself like Zephyrus and being under Apollo's employ, it's kind of like a petty little act of revenge of Apollo's towards Zephyrus to get back at him for taking away hyacinths from him by taking away his precious baby sister, essentially. And that's it for my concoction of a Greek deity. If you're still curious and want to learn more about her, or you still have questions for aspects of her lore, or just want to see how the other Greek gods tie into this, I have made an Ask account just for her because I am cringe like that. So feel free to send an ask. Thank you so much for hanging out in my channel for a while. I hope your skin didn't get too pruny. Big shout out to my lovely pond dwellers on Patreon. If you want to become a pond dweller and get early access to my content, join my Patreon. If you want to see more from me, then please follow me on all my social media. If you want to submit fan art or chat with me, join my Discord server. And if you want more of my stories, check out my Wildward series here on YouTube because that will make me really happy. All the links are in my description and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye!